Hi, hello everybody. Welcome back to THE student webinars on this wonderful Wednesday afternoon. How is everybody today? I hope you're good. So thank you so much for tuning in to watch our webinar with Royal College of Art. They are here today to discuss everything about the US and the UK and why you should choose them to study with. So I'm going to hand over to Lorna, who is going to be your main host for today.
Thank you very much. So my name is Lorna Gossard. I'm the Director of Communications and Marketing at the Royal College of Art, and I work a lot with our student recruitment activity, welcoming students from all over the world. In terms of the session of the topic today, we're actually going to look at art and design degrees in the UK and in the US. And it's very much an informal discussion. It's not necessarily a kind of blow-by-blow account of exactly how everything works in exactly each country. But we've got a few amazing kind of people joining us today who can talk about their experiences, where they see some of the comparison points, and also some of the things that it's useful to know in terms of getting the most out of studying either in the UK or in the US. So to start off with, I'm just going to ask the panel to introduce themselves, and perhaps if we could start with my colleague Danielle.
Hi there, thanks Lorna. So my name's Danielle Barrios O'Neill. I am the head of program for information experience design at the RCA. So you can probably tell from my accent that I'm from the US. I'm from Atlanta originally. And so I did my BA in the US in an arts program at a really big kind of state university. Then I did my MA at a smaller program, sort of more competitive in the US still. Then I did my PhD in the UK, and then I've taught at two really different art schools in the UK. So I'll be kind of speaking from, I guess, from my experience as a student at undergraduate and postgraduate level in both places, kind of thing, and then from a teaching perspective as well.
And then if I can introduce my colleague David. David?
Hello, my name is David Burns. I'm a senior tutor in the School of Architecture. Danielle and I have strikingly similar backgrounds, which I didn't realize, but I'm also from the States, from Nashville, Tennessee. I did my BArch at a huge state school. I did a post-professional master's in New England at a very small competitive school. And I've also taught. I've taught at large state schools in the US and private schools like Carnegie Mellon University, and also in Australia and here as well. And I did my PhD at Goldsmiths. So I kind of have that sort of spread across North America, Australia, and also the UK.
Fantastic. And then finally, Sean, would you be able to introduce yourself, please?
Hello, my name is Sean Lund. I'm the coordinator for English for academic purposes at the Royal College of Art. And I'm here because I work around the world with language and communication skills. And I have noticed here in an art and design context how important it is about the ways in which communication is used. So it's used for dialogic purposes, so that conversation is very important, talking about your work, reflecting and thinking about your work through conversation and through conversations with students and tutors. And the way that this is important in the learning process is very particular to art and design. So I'm looking at it from a perspective of how you communicate and how important dialogue, reflection, and critical analysis is to communicate in your work.
Thank you very much, Sean. So perhaps if we start with a really broad question, which I'm going to perhaps aim Danielle at you first, and then we might go to David. If you had to summarize, and I know this is probably a bit tricky, kind of the key differences to the approach to teaching art, design, architecture, or the way that the education system works in the UK and the US, particularly at the kind of postgraduate level, which is obviously where the RCA is focused. Are there particular things that you would bring out as differences? Are there particular things that you would bring out as similarities? It'd be great to hear from you first, Danielle, and then perhaps David afterwards.
Okay, so I'll start with And thanks for the question. It's a really good question. I think that I'll start with similarities, because actually there are some really obvious ones in terms of certain disciplinary conventions. You kind of, in terms of, for example, well, with design, with illustration, or one of the disciplines that's quite well established, you do have the same, more or less the same kind of academic frameworks that you're working with. You have the same kind of, so you're drawing on the same traditions. It's all Western Eurocentric kind of intellectual tradition, so and artistic tradition. So in many ways, they're very, very similar. In terms of the differences, I think it's more around how the curriculum is delivered. I have found that the US system is more, and also, I mean, I'm thinking that probably, David, you can comment on this as well, because you might have different experience to me, but my experience of the US system is that it's more structured than the UK system, partly, I think, because it's been designed to scale for a much longer period of time. So in order to serve a larger number of students, you essentially have very well-structured kind of system, so that people can do the sort of the liberal arts thing, where you kind of take lots of different classes or units or modules from different areas. So your average kind of MA student at the university that I was at you might spend the first half of your day on one part of the campus, and then you go to a completely different part of the campus for the second half of your day, and you're with completely different people, because you're in a kind of multidisciplinary back and forth kind of environment. In the MA programs at the RCA, for example, or also I used to teach at Falmouth, which is an art college as well in the UK, you are really with one community most of the time, one community of students and staff. And so there are kind of benefits to that and drawbacks to that. So it feels more homey, you kind of belong. You have, in my experience, kind of really close relationships with the staff in your sort of area. But then also, you do, like, it's a little bit harder to get access, I think, to other kind of disciplines sometimes. In the US, I think there's maybe more openness around that. That said, I think the RCA is actually pretty good about this, in kind of building ways for us to work in between, and having kind of cross-college and cross-school units that are like a really big part of the degree. So, but it's just not it's not been a thing as long as that's been a thing in the US. So I think that there is a bit more kind of structure and flexibility in US degrees, and a bit more kind of specialization and community in UK degrees. I'll stop there and let David maybe give his view.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of the things that Danielle said. In architecture, we have a kind of a specific condition in which we are professionally regulated. So in the US, that would be the AIA. Here in the UK, it's the RIBA. Excuse me. So a lot of the units that we teach and the structures that we have are regulated by people above us or outside of the university. That said, in the School of Architecture, we have multiple degrees. We have 5 programs running simultaneously. Some of them are professionally regulated and others are not. So some are highly interdisciplinary, and some have a professional structure that we have to follow. I think the liberal arts thing is probably the most distinct difference between the US and Australia, and the US and the UK. But postgraduate studies, so the equivalent of 4th and 5th year in a traditional Bachelor of Architecture degree, you're already starting to specialize quite closely. So I think the differences between here and there on that regard are probably a little bit less in our school. I think the major difference is the student body in terms of the makeup and the locations from where they're from. And obviously the US has an enormous breadth of universities that would offer you different experiences. But my experience in the UK is that the student body is spread out from all over the world. And we consider that one of our biggest strengths. So students that come to UK to study, obviously, I'm not from the UK. A lot of my colleagues are also from all over the world, but our student body is truly diverse. And that's really exciting. I think it's one of the things that the RCA does very, very well.
Yeah, I think in fact this year we've got students from over 80 different countries studying at the RCA, so it really is a kind of really broad mix. Thank you both. That was really helpful as kind of an opening statement. I wonder if then thinking a little bit about the differences in the kind of the way that study happens in the US or in the UK, or indeed in kind of other international environments. If you're coming to the UK from a background where you've perhaps not studied in the UK at undergraduate level, whether that's in the US or whether that's somewhere else kind of internationally, do you think that there are any things that people need to particularly think about or bear in mind in terms of adapting to the specific cultural and academic environment of studying in the UK? And I'll perhaps start with David on that first. Is there anything that's distinct about that UK cultural and academic environment? And then what do people need to consider and what do people need to bear in mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think coming from the US, it just depends on where you're coming from. So if you studied in New York City and you're coming to London, a lot of the cultural differences will feel very normal. I mean, because living in a very large city, a very active and bustling place. But if you come from like a land grant university, if you come from studying in a more remote part of the US, I think one of the biggest cultural differences is just learning London, which we would think of as, we consider to be one of our the most alluring things about coming here is because you do get to live in London. In terms of kind of cultural differences in the program, I think that students from the US would understand the master's programs in architecture quite well, because they're focused on things like design studios and technologies and making and theory and history. And those things are somewhat universal in terms of schools of architecture. The kind of, I think the cultural difference would be the professional regulation that they might come under, whether or not they're looking to work in the UK as an architect. That would need some education, just in terms of learning how to navigate the process of getting those jobs and visas. I think we've all struggle with visas. It's a thing, and it's something that needs advice. And the good thing is so many of our tutors and staff are also not from the UK, so that can be navigated very easily. So I think that's probably how I would jump on that.
Danielle, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'd echo that. And in fact, kind of, I want to emphasize the point that was made earlier about the kind of the fact that if you're in a US university as a student who's not from there, you are likely to be in the minority for sure. So I know David said that, but I just want to like underline that is very much the case, whereas that is not the case at all in London art schools, for example. So I think that matters for sure in terms of it. I think that there is a thing about, like, when it comes to culture, I mean, it's the difference between being like you're completely kind of immersed in, let's say if you go to like an art school in Savannah, Georgia, you're completely immersed in like Southern kind of US culture, and that is a very specific thing, and it's you have to just accommodate that. And there are good things and bad things about that. And if you are in London, you're at the RCA or at UAL, you're going to be at a university where basically you're surrounded by people who are also not from there, which means the system is set up to accommodate you as opposed to for you to have to accommodate it, which is important. I'd also say there's what Shan brought up about sort of the conversational element of the curriculum. I think that's a really important part of the kind of culture as well of the art school, that I didn't even fully appreciate until I was teaching specifically at the RCA, because it's even more intense at the RCA than some other places. So what I'm talking about is the fact that a lot of, whereas other places that I've taught and where I've been a student, you might have a lot of like one lecturer speaking to a large group of people, and that's a huge part of your education. That's maybe the biggest part of your education is, you know, one lecturer, class of 30 students kind of thing, or more. In the kind of art school experience you get at a place like the RCA, really, like in my program, that rarely happens. I think we have about 12 lectures a year that are like that. And the rest of the time you're with really small groups discussing your work. You're sitting with tutors one-to-one discussing your work. It's much more conversational. So the sort of crit model is essentially where, if you're not familiar, it's where you're kind of basically bringing your work, whatever you're working on, your tutor is with you and maybe some other classmates, and you are essentially looking at it together and really digging into it together. And that can feel quite a lot at this. It can be quite uncomfortable if you're not used to that and you're used to just being a passive member of a group who doesn't have to speak back and doesn't have to kind of say anything. So that is something that it's important to understand before you arrive, that actually you do have to really be ready to talk about your work with people regularly. Like that is a really big part of it.
I think that actually probably leads us nicely into maybe asking a question of Sian, which is, you know, Danielle's just talked there about the importance of being able to talk about your work, to be able to communicate creative practices, ideas. Obviously, you know, as a global university, people will come with different standards of English. People will also come with different levels of experience in doing that. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about how we train students and support students in being able to really communicate those ideas.
Yeah, thank you. So I'd take up what Danielle said about the college is set up to be an inclusive environment, so that we understand that it's new for everybody, and the way of communicating and the learning process at the college might be unusual or different for anybody. So regardless of your first language, we take the process of the learning and exploration that happens at the college. So as Danielle said, it's a lot of discussion among tutors and staff, and it's about exploring your practice, and you as an autonomous researcher exploring and asking questions and looking at yourself and how you work and what your processes are, and responding to questions that people ask about your work and your context. So the whole conversation that you have, we provide guidance and support for that particular context. So our support and guidance in academic skills is about what your learning processes are at the college and how the learning outcomes on your programs can be communicated. So how do you talk about your work? How do you express your critical thinking behind your work? We have developed a program and courses that take you through those steps, bringing in outside perspectives, using them to talk about your influences, using them to talk about why you do what you do in your practice. And we have rated exemplary practice in this area for our courses because they are constructively aligned. They follow the kind of communication that is used at the college. So I hope that explains that area.
That was very helpful. Thank you. I'm going to move on now slightly because both Danielle and kind of David have alluded to London and kind of, you know, learning London and the impact in London. And I think particularly as kind of, you know, Americans who have come to London, it would be really great to take your get your kind of take on, you know, has that influenced your creative process, your perspective or not? Are there things that are particularly exciting about living in London that you feel has kind of been a benefit in terms of either your career development, your networks, or the process of where you are now? And I might start with Danielle, seeing as I started with David last time.
Okay, so I have some particular views on this actually, which are kind of about London as a sort of scene. So I have found, and I've only been in London for 4 years, just under 4 years. And I was not a student in London, so that's important to know. So this is kind of based on my observations of of students that I speak to, and also my own interactions with kind of the art scene in London since I've been here. So London is a huge city, but it's a huge city of which the arts and culture are incredibly important, but they're not the biggest part of what's going on in London. Millions of things are going on in London all the time. So the actual art scene in London, incredibly important, incredibly influential, and also pretty accessible because it's not huge. Like the UK is tiny compared to the US. So it is actually reasonably easy to get in touch with people that you want to meet, to contact people who you want to make a connection with, to visit an exhibition. You don't have to wait in a line around the block generally. London is not, even though it's a big city, New York is a big city, but my experience in both, I would say that actually London, the art scene in terms of, and also industry, is probably way more accessible than any US city that I've lived in. New York might be an exception to that, but I might get you to talk about that, David, because you sort of lived up that way.
Yeah, I think London is. Some of us came here because we wanted to live in London and we wanted to be in this kind of culture. In terms of architecture, we're surrounded by other enormous schools of architecture, and that provides opportunities for students to basically be exposed to anything they want to be exposed to. And I think that's a major difference. Obviously, I studied at Columbia in New York, and there was also Pratt and CUNY and the New School. And here it's a little bit different because the AA is very close. The Bartlett is very close. These other schools are, to kind of echo Danielle, they are very accessible, meaning students go there all the time for events and lectures. And then staff, in terms of like research opportunities, you're kind of, it's a bit, you get spoiled with how many opportunities there are to work with other staff members from other universities. I think the accessibility thing is really interesting that Danielle brought up. I think London compared to New York they're kind of the exact same. Whatever you want to get involved in, you just have to be very focused on doing it, right? New York is very compacted. Feels very intense. London feels more like a city of small cities. And I think, the experiences that you want to have, a lot of that is just up to you and going out and asking for those things. One thing that I would also add, which I think has been brought up, is that the RCA does not have an undergrad. So everyone coming in is also looking for those connections. That there's no undergraduate culture that people are just continuing when they're doing their postgraduate work. I love that. I love it because each group that comes in, they're kind of reinventing the RCA for themselves. And it also means that students are very keen to kind of get to know each other as quickly as they can, because they want to also share what they've learned about London. And, the people that are from London, they become very popular because, of course, they know how to get around and where to go out.
Thank you very much. There's some really useful observations, and all things that, as somebody who's lived here for a very long time, I don't think that I would have picked up on. So I think kind of having, you touched, David, just then on postgraduate and the fact that we're kind of solely postgraduate. And I think kind of, just zooming back perhaps for a little bit and just kind of focusing on the idea of postgraduate study. What would you kind of say the main advantages really are of postgraduate study? What are the skills that you see your students developing in the time here? What's the kind of things that they go on to do next? And again, I'll perhaps start with you, David, because obviously architecture has a very specific structure around it in terms of study layers.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. If you want to be a professional architect, you don't have a choice. You have to do postgraduate study. But you can do those in various countries. So there's more and more reciprocity. For instance, if you are from Australia and you want to do your what they call in the UK your part 2, you can do that in the UK and work through the system of getting reciprocity for those things. For the other programs that don't have a professional affiliation, you know, the postgraduate work is the thing that sets you apart, right? Because it's the moment in which you can really focus on yourself. And that's one thing I think that I say probably too much to the students, is that this is the moment in which they can define perhaps their career trajectory in terms of what they want to be known for. So meeting the people that they want to collaborate with, working on a project they've never done before, but they have all the resources at the RCA and they can do it in relative kind of, not anonymity, but they can do it under the structure and protection of a university, whereas professionally to experiment like that can be very risky. So I think the postgraduate culture is fantastic. It's also, having taught everything from first years to PhD supervision, teaching postgrad is really exciting because the students are a little bit older. They come here knowing what they want to do. The RCA is such a powerful place that they're geared up, right? When they walk in the door, for the most part, they're ready to go. And we really like that. And we start running. We assume their bachelor's education has kind of imparted onto them certain kind of skills that they kind of know already. And then once they get into postgraduate level, it becomes much more critical. It becomes more about themselves. It becomes kind of creating new knowledge and new ideas of practice.
Thank you, Danielle. What would you like to add to that?
Right. So I echo so much of what David has said, but I guess there's a couple of important differences. So because I'm not coming from architecture, so the program I head up, information experience design. So that is, in short, it's students working across like many different media and with often sort of mixing analog and digital, or working in immersive with like big immersive environment kind of experiences or installations. So we've got huge diversity. And so what that means is that often students come into our program with a sense of, I know I like to challenge boundaries and combine lots of different subjects and be really super interdisciplinary and do things that are surprising and challenging to existing structures. But I don't know where to do that or what you call that. And so that's how people often end up in IED. And so for us, we have a kind of specific thing that happens alongside some of the stuff that David has said, like the resources at the RCA, that's universal, or at almost any really good art school, are going to be fantastic for just developing what you do next. And by resources, I mean the facilities, the workshops, the just expert staff, the expert academics that you have around you, who will want to support you. I mean, that's a very important resource. Like, so no matter where you are, it's like making friends with the people who you really chime with, the academics that you really connect with. They will want to support you, and that's a huge resource no matter where you go. I think that there's also, so all of that is hugely important in terms of like developing your career, because those are going to be people who help you get where you're going and that you have relationships with that last maybe the rest of your life. Specifically in IED, I think we also have this thing of, we're sort of in between design methodologies and fine art methodologies. We use both. And so we have a lot of people who end up going on to, like, they use the year to basically develop their signature practice, which is kind of what David was describing. And so it's really about, you develop the thing that you are going to become known for. You start your trajectory in a really defined way, and we kind of help you identify that and articulate that and do that. And then we have a whole bunch of other people who come in and they just want to work, they want to make really cool tech, basically. And some of them go on to work for Google or Apple or Intuit or whatever. So we actually have students, and those students, like if there was one of each of those that I just described, they would actually be collaborating together on the program too, which is quite cool. So, I mean, there aren't that many times in life that you have the opportunity to kind of collaborate with people who are so different to you. And I think that that's quite important as well as a part of the MA experience at an art school. It's like you have access to a lot of fantastic talent, like in terms of the other students that are around you as well. So yeah, I mean, I think the people, as much as anything, is hugely, like a hugely important reason to do it.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. I can see there have been a couple of interesting questions that have come up in the chat, which I'm going to use to kind of just shape a few questions around, actually, some of which have been answered, but I think give us some kind of interesting areas to look at. So one of which was someone had mentioned about whether or not it's possible to kind of work part-time before doing the course. Now, just because I know that some people who might be listening to this might also be thinking about other kind of areas of study, legally, it is possible as an international student on your visa to work for, I think, up to 20 hours a week in the UK. However, one of the things that we always emphasize with our MAs is that our MAs are full-time programs, and that, you know, if you're going to come and do a 45-week MA for 1 year, or the architecture MAs are slightly longer, you also need to make sure that you're getting the best value out of that. But I wondered if both David and Danielle, you had any kind of views on kind of how students can get the most out of a program while they're here, but perhaps balance some of those other needs in terms of work or networking, or, you know, the many other things that kind of demands on your time. How do you see students doing it well? What is it that you would recommend? David, maybe you could start.
Okay.
Yeah.
We do have a lot of students that maintain part-time jobs while they're doing their MA. It's very difficult for the exact reasons that you just articulated. It is a full-time degree, and it takes a lot of focus and time. Obviously, the cost of education and living is high. So this is something that we're very, very sensitive to, and try our best to advise students. I think getting the most out of, let's say you're coming from the US, or you're coming from another country and you're coming to the UK and you're not familiar with the UK, I think the best thing you can do is just to immerse yourself in all of the events and things happening around your discipline. You could go to events every single night at the RCA, but for instance, if you're studying architecture, you also have all the other universities that are teaching architecture here that you can go and network. Those things are hugely important. And while a part-time job is also very important in terms of supporting yourself, the networking that you can do to kind of meet those people that you might work for when you finish your degree, or that you might work with, or start your own collective or your own practice, that to me is the investment that you're making in a post-professional or postgraduate degree. I think, you know, that's why I did one, was to kind of change my context. And I think that's really, really important. I feel like there's something else you asked that I was going to comment on, but
No, I think you covered that pretty well. I'm going to pass to Danielle to see if she's got anything to add to that.
So I mean, it is a tricky one, because I'm aware that some people come to, like, it's so important for what you want to do in life that you do a degree, that you do a postgraduate degree in your discipline, or at the RCA, or whatever it may be. And the only way that you can do that is if you also work alongside it. And I think that is, whilst I totally agree that you are setting yourself up for, it is going to be intense, really intense. But I know that there are at least a couple of students who are in that situation who have been quite open with me, in my program. And I was like, look, it's going to be tough before they started, when they were applying. In fact, we sort of had a conversation where we talked it through, and I was like, look, it's going to be hard. This is what the year looks like. You're going to have to be careful in how you schedule things. And this is a full-time degree. So you have to look at it that way. And your work is going to be above and beyond that. So you know what your kind of capacity is, and what you can do. I do think that there is a sacrifice of all of the things that you might do around your discipline, as David was sort of mentioning. It's like you are going to miss out on some of that stuff, or most of that stuff, if you are also working. However, if working is the only way that this can be a thing that you do in your life, is to work alongside it, then, I mean, that's a decision you make. And that's, I'm not going to tell you not to do it, because I mean, basically there are going to be years in your life that are tricky. And if this is one of them and something great comes out of it, then that's great. But I mean, I do think that there is a kind of responsibility to be clear about the fact that it is going to be really hard if you do it that way. I do work with the students who I know are working a bit. I do work with them to try to keep things flexible for them. So basically I sort of let their personal tutors know, for example, that they've got commitments that if they can be flexible around those, that's good. I let them know the schedule ahead of time, as we do with everybody. So it is possible. It's possible. It's not easy.
And I would also add to that probably does vary from program to program, in that there are some programs where that flexibility just isn't possible because of things being kind of delivered to a particular scale or to a particular kind of timeline. So I think there's a kind of strong note of caution is probably the best way of summing that up. It's also worth knowing that the RCA does offer a number of scholarships. We do also have things like hardship support for students if they are struggling financially, and information on all of that is on our website, because we are very keen that obviously as many people as possible are able to study here and that people aren't excluded for purely financial reasons. So if that is an area that's important to you, do visit the website. And we do also a couple of times a year have online events where we talk a little bit more about the scholarship program and how to apply for the scholarship program. Now, one of the things in terms of being able to access things like additional sources of funding that we talk about is getting your application in relatively early. And I can also see in the chat that we've got some questions about portfolios. So I don't know if perhaps both Danielle and David, you could talk a little bit about the application process for your programs, because I think there's a similarity across all of the programs in terms of how that kind of process works. But then also somebody I think had particularly kind of said, how do you make your portfolio really stand out? What are the things that you're looking for? And again, I suspect there is a similarity in terms of what we're looking for across the board, not just at a program specific level. So perhaps Danielle, if you could go first.
Okay, so it's a good question, and I will give you feedback, which is it's specific to my program and what we sort of look for and what we talk about as a program. So basically, because the program is very much about demonstrating that you're an independent thinker, that you have strong ideas about the kind of work that you want to do, and that you're brave and adventurous with your practice, we do look for projects that show that in the portfolio. And when there's a kind of a short video, like I think you have space to do like a 3-minute sort of video, we listen to that carefully to find out what kind of person you are, basically, like what your sort of personality is like. And then in the sort of written bit and in the kind of portfolio upload section, you get a chance to kind of show us your work and talk about the background of your work. So we want to be impressed by your adventurousness in the kind of work you want to do and how you think, much more interested in compelling ideas, really interesting ideas, rather than perfectly executed technical outcomes. Because the technical outcomes, we can get you there during the year, but what we want to see is that you've got great ideas. So focus on the ideas rather than technical perfection. Also, get it down to like 3 projects. Don't show us more than that. And also have a sense of what, if there's like a kind of narrative or theme or a common interest that kind of draws your work together a bit, or maybe a couple of interests that show up frequently in your work, talk about those. Like, because there is a sort of thing of, so climate change, climate emergency, everybody is interested in climate emergency now. So that is not massively interesting to us as a panel when we're looking at it at the portfolio. But if someone's like, I'm specifically interested in how you can use wearables that have sensors to detect your emotional state and how we can use that for climate change, then that becomes interesting. So there is a kind of, it's like, get specific, help us remember who you are when we're thinking about later on who we want to bring in. Yeah, that's it from me.
Yeah, I totally agree. The portfolio is a critical aspect of the application. There's also, I can't remember, Danielle, if you said that, I'm already blanking, but there's also a chance to produce a short video in which students can kind of introduce themselves. And that's because there aren't as many interviews now as there used to be, like one-to-one interviews. So the portfolio becomes really critical. And I think one thing that students in architecture do incorrectly is they kind of assume that a portfolio they've produced to apply for one university applies to all universities. And that's just not the case. And I think a student applying to the RCA in architecture or in any program should know what that program is doing. What are they most focused on? And that's looking at the dean, looking at the heads of program, looking at the senior tutors, and kind of getting an idea about, okay, what's the community like there? Who are they inviting in for their external lectures? Because that gives a real insight as to the trajectory of the program and the school and also the college. So oftentimes we'll get these portfolios that are just massive. They just kind of include everything the student's ever done. And that is not helpful. What is helpful is what Danielle said, is like the people that show true creativity and also critical thinking and intelligence in their work. That's the kind of person that we want to work with, because showing just a project that you feel like is your best project often isn't the kind of project that shows us what you're like as a person. And you're applying because you don't have your kind of expertise yet. And that's what we're going to help you develop. So it's truly, yeah, I agree. It's like, who's the person in there, and how do we know that from day one they're going to be pushing us as much as, you know, we're pushing them.
I think that's really interesting. Thank you. And I kind of obviously spend a lot of time with admissions tutors and with kind of other tutors talking about what they're looking for. And it's a kind of real similarity. I think a couple of things to also add on that particular topic is, I think sometimes people feel put off because they don't necessarily come from a traditional art and design background and they don't have a very polished portfolio. And actually, I think, as Danielle and David have both emphasized, it's not necessarily about having a polished portfolio. It's about the thinking and the creativity and about who you are and why you want to go in this particular direction. The other thing just to make people aware of is that about once a month, we do also do portfolio advice sessions with the specific admissions tutors for the schools. So there's one for arts and humanities, one for architecture, one for design, one for communication. And again, if you are working on an application and you want to hear at a little bit more of a school specific level about what we're looking for, those are really great sessions to try and join to get more information about. On that topic, Sian, I was wondering also if you could talk about a little bit perhaps about English language requirements for studying in the UK, because if you do come from a non-English majority speaking country, either at the moment you're kind of based in that country, or even if you've then been studying in the US and are looking at moving to the UK, there are also specific requirements around that. So perhaps, Sian, if you could just give us a bit more detail on that.
Sorry. So yes, we require you to take a language test, which at the moment we have online tests, which usually IELTS, and we also have another one called Password. You need to take the test, and it includes 4 skills, and you need to reach the level of 6.5 with all the other skills at 6. So you can have a look at the pages online to see exactly what the test would include: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. I'm sure that many people have had a look at those. But if you don't get that level and you get a little bit below that, so if you only reach level 6, we have a summer course that you can come to develop your language, but it's much better than just taking the test, because our program looks at the communication and the research and the collaborative communication skills which are required at the RCA. So we also look at reading texts that are used across the college. We invite speakers to come in to talk about the themes and the ideas that are being talked about at the college. So it's a much broader focused, but broader but specific attention to the kind of speaking skills that you would need in your programs at the RCA. So you do need IELTS, but you can also come to one of our summer programs. We have one program which is 8 weeks and one which is 4 weeks. 4 weeks is for anybody who has reached the right level of language test, but you'd like to brush up on these skills. So we have 4 weeks of intensive study of reading and discussion and reflective writing and structuring of your writing, the kind of writing and the kind of speaking and the kind of reading that you will need to do on your program at the RCA. So
Thank you very much, Sean. That is very useful in terms of background. I think there's a question in here which might lead us to kind of a broader kind of question, one of which is about paid research opportunities at the RCA. And I think actually it's one of the things that sometimes I think is kind of an interesting difference that I observe, which is that what we don't have is teaching PhD students at the RCA. You know, there are some kind of university setups where you will come in and a lot of the kind of teaching is delivered by PhD students, and that isn't necessarily the case. And so I wondered actually if David and Danielle, you could talk a little bit about that kind of teaching setup at the RCA and the sorts of people that you are likely to be taught by. Yes, because I think it is different as in kind of quite a few kind of other establishments. Maybe David, if you want to go first.
Sure. You know, the PhD sort of requirement in architecture has changed radically in the 20 years that I've been teaching. When I finished my master's, no one did PhDs unless they were going to be specifically in history or theory. And now PhDs are very, very, very common, and our PhD program is quite large. So the people that teach into my primary unit, which is a large school-wide unit of 300 students, those staff come from a wide variety of disciplines. My unit is specifically teaching kind of non-built environment things, so it's very media focused, it's very fine art focused. But we have people that have graduated in photography and in architecture and design and filmmaking and editing and human rights across the board. And one thing that we push really hard in our school is that when students kind of show up to a unit, they're given an option about who they want to work with. And that allows the student to kind of fine tune their degree to kind of what they're focused on in the future. So, you know, we have some tutors that are practicing artists that are not involved with academia that often. We also have people that have worked for a decade in higher education and work at multiple universities. So there's a really wide range of people. Also in the design studio aspect, there are lots of practicing architects and large, you know, well-known figures that teach our design studios. So students get exposed to a very diverse group of people teaching from not only architecture. I mean, a lot of their tutors will come from other fields, which we feel like is equally as important.
Danielle, have you got anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, so we actually work quite similarly in the sense that when you come in, you have a chance to kind of get to know the research backgrounds and the teaching specialisms and the practice backgrounds of the staff. And then we have 6, we call them field collectives, that are within the program this year. And they are, if I can remember them all. So we've got Future Cities, which is about urban practices. We've got Future Interspecies Entanglements, which is about sort of working and practicing in collaboration with non-humans. We've got Future of Intelligence, which is probably what you'd expect. It's mostly about AI. We've got I'm not going to be able to remember now. I always blank on the last two. We've got Future Society, which is about inclusive design, and then there's Future Worlds, which is world building focused. So we basically have, and that is completely down to the research backgrounds and interests of the staff teaching in IED, our kind of core teaching staff. So they also would supervise PhDs. So in those kind of subject areas, as I do myself. And so we do have that kind of environment. PhD students occasionally, so PhD students that are within the school, particularly ones that are supervised by people in IED, do occasionally come in and run workshops with students it's not on a paid kind of employed basis. It's more like if they want to run something to gather data or get information for their own research, and MA students want to see how that works and be a part of that process. We do that quite often. But one thing that does happen a lot at the RCA, which I have not experienced elsewhere, and we do a lot in IED, is that MA students are often brought back as alumni to teach workshops and do things almost immediately after graduating. We often have people back. Also, we have there are paid things now and then, which are more about sharing your work or kind of, it'll be related to your specific practice, but we have done a few paid things with current students. But we have one of the more exciting things is that we get MA students involved in research at a level that they wouldn't normally be. So at the moment, we've got I'm on a paper, which is like a sort of paper for publication with other staff at the RCA in our Textile Circularity Center. And we've brought in 3 IED students to collaborate on that paper because we're writing about their work. So they're actually authors on a published paper before they graduated with their MA, which is quite cool. And unusual, really, as far as MA programs go. So I think it's partly because of the sort of research focus at the RCA that's possible. So MA students actually get quite a lot of research sort of experience within their degree. So that's one of the reasons why that's possible.
Thank you very much. And again, I suppose it's kind of worth making the point that kind of every program is slightly different, but hopefully that's given you kind of a flavor of how those kind of staffing works and how things come together. I'm very conscious that we've only got 8 minutes left, and I can see there are kind of a few questions, which I'll just kind of quickly run through, but I would also then encourage people, if you have any last questions, just to drop them into the chat. So I think we've covered the question about paid research opportunities. Internships, I think very much was covered when we were talking about employment. We don't have, as far as I'm aware, fixed internships as part of the programs. Obviously, as everybody's alluded to, we do work very closely with employers. We work very closely. Oh, David, I think has something that he wants to add there.
Yeah, we don't, in our school, we don't offer internships, but we do have a large group of practice mentors. And so that allows students to go and visit practices and talk with people about what it's like to work in the UK. So yeah, I just wanted to add that that's something that I think students really enjoy, but it's not work. It's not, you're not giving free work. It's just to learn about those learn about those practices rather.
Danielle, did you have anything you wanted to add on that front?
Well, yeah, so we have something, it's called our professional practice sort of series, which has a similar kind of function. So we basically have about 6 times a year, we'll invite professionals in from the different kind of areas that are applicable for IED. So there's quite a broad range for us actually, but we basically bring people in and they give a talk on kind of their area, and then we have a sort of workshop and seminar and Q&A sort of, so it's kind of a full day thing where you get to really get to know like what their area is and whether that's sort of if they're working for if they're part of a cooperative, or if they've started a sort of design studio, or if they're, you know, working for, I don't know, like a corporation. Like they're really different, actually. Also, as part of that, we do a series about funding, which is basically, it's just about how to get arts funding, which is very, very important, obviously, for people who want to go on to be practicing artists.
Thank you very much. Someone else has asked, how easy is it to find housing in London, which I suspect is kind of a somewhat kind of perennial question. I mean, as we've kind of pointed out, London is a large city, and so it's not necessarily like some of the cities that have perhaps been highlighted in the UK, where, you know, almost they've run out of student housing because there's a kind of limit to the size of the city. What I would say is that we do provide a degree of support to students who are coming, particularly students who are relocating. I think Sian has flagged our student services facilities in the chat to some people, but we do offer advice on housing and support through our student support. That isn't to say that they will find you a house, but they will be able to give some direction in terms of how to kind of where to look. And we do also run some sessions in the run up to the start of term, which again can give people more advice on accommodation and housing with our offer holders. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything to that, but I think Sian, would you like to add anything?
Just to say that there is a lot of advice on our web page, and I've just put the link specifically to finding accommodation in London, so that might help.
Yeah. So, you know, we're not a university that has halls because we are dealing with postgraduate students, but, you know, London is a very large city. So perhaps doesn't have some of the problems that kind of smaller cities in the UK have seen over the last couple of years. And then finally, I think someone had mentioned, what if I work with a charity and would like to share a different view of the world through fine art? I think that echoes exactly what people have been saying about, tell us what motivates you, tell us what interests you, tell us what your kind of creativity is. That I think those are the kind of, you know, that's when in the application process you have that ability to tell people about you and what it is that drives you and what it is that motivates you. We've got 4 minutes left, and so I just wanted to, I can see one more question, hang on, but I just wanted to wrap up this session by giving everybody a minute to say if you had one piece of advice that you would want to give people about coming to London, studying London, postgraduate study, maybe something that you'd known before you kind of went down this kind of particular kind of, you know, you went down this kind of route of your career. What is one piece of advice that you would give people if they are kind of thinking about coming and studying postgraduate at London or kind of at the RCA? So I will maybe start with David, because I can see he's smiling. So I'm going to assume that's because he's got a great idea.
Always. No, I think, you know, hearing Danielle's background and thinking about my own, I know that when I went from bachelor's to master's, I made sure that I went to someplace completely different from where I did my early studies. And I think that was really big for me. So the idea of, I applied actually to one university here and got in, but decided not to do it. But going overseas, I think it's a fantastic opportunity. If you have the ability to do it and it's something that you're interested in, you know, I think coming to London and coming to the RCA especially is it's a really it's an extraordinary opportunity. So yeah, I mean, I would say, yeah, do it. Come on.
Thank you. Danielle, have you got anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's not just because this is hosted by the RCA and I work at the RCA, but like if I had known what the RCA was like, I would have done my master's at the RCA. Like, no question. There is a kind of like, it is just really brilliant. It's a great experience. And part of that is about London, as to kind of echo David. So, I mean, sorry, my cat has just decided she's part of the conversation. London is amazing. But also, I mean, there's a maybe more sort of general piece of advice, which is that this, if you're going to do this anyway, and you don't end up doing it at the RCA or even in London, this is sort of more general advice, like the year or 2 years that you spend doing your MA is going to be one of the few times where it is really just about you developing your work and investing in yourself in a way that, yeah, it's very special. It's a very special thing, and it's quite rare in life. So I think that to do it, to enjoy it and embrace it and make the most of it, and embrace the hard as well, because it will be hard, but it'll also be incredible. I mean, I think that it's very exciting. So I'm excited for you, actually. But I just want to sort of say, like, let it be about you. Enjoy the experience. It's a very important one.
Thank you. And Sian, have you got anything that you'd like to add?
Just that, I mean, I've lived in London and studied in London for 35, not studied, but lived in London for over 35 years. And it is an amazing city. And having lived in other cities in the world, it is very multicultural. As the others have said, you can explore what you want to explore, and you can be finding different areas of London, different cultures and different ways of life around the city. That's free. There's a lot of things you can do that are free.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, people either who have joined us today or who are going to kind of watch this afterwards. We hope that this has answered some of your questions. And if you do want any more information, please do go to the RCA website. As we've suggested, it's a great source of information, not only about us and our programs, but also around things like generally living, working and studying in London. So thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. That was a brilliant presentation there. To those of you who are watching on Facebook, thank you so much as well. And for all of your questions, we'll be in touch very shortly from the RCA, and they will be there to talk to you and ask you why you would like to study with them. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Good night and good evening wherever you are. Bye-bye.